For a brief moment, on the morning of September 11, 2001, Teresa Garcia thought she'd seen a ghost. She was in her office in midtown Manhattan, watching the news of the attacks on the World Trade Center, when he walked in. He was covered with dust. All white dust. And we couldn't even recognize him, Garcia says, recalling that day. But he talked to my coworker and he said Esperanza. And she said, Chino, is that you? Garcia works at Asociacion Tepeyac in New York, a non-profit that assists mostly Latino immigrants with English language skills, legal aid and tax assistance. The man who walked in, Chino, was an undocumented immigrant. Garcia is using only nickname to protect his identity. He had been heading over to start his shift at a restaurant at one of the towers, when the first plane hit. In shock, he made his way to Asociacion Tepeyac, to see Garcia and her colleague Esperanza Chacon. He came over to her, Esperanza, Garcia says, and he embraced her, and they started crying. Little by little, dozens of workers started filing into Tepeyac's offices, looking for comfort among Friday. But what stood out were those who were missing, their friends who worked as cooks and cleaners, at or near the World Trade Center. The workers who'd gathered at Tepeyac started compiling a list, which in the next few days grew to 700 missing people. Almost all immigrants, many undocumented. That list was important. In order to get financial or medical aid, New Yorkers or their families had to prove they worked at or near Ground Zero and that they were affected by the attack. Knowing who was there also would allow families to mourn, to bring closure. For years, the people at Tepeyac and other families have been trying to prove the immigrants who worked at the World Trade Center existed. That effort has proved to be extremely challenging. How do you prove a person, who deliberately had tried to stay hidden from the system, was real without the proper documentation? Garcia and the others could see a bureaucratic nightmare beginning to unfold and they got to work. Tepeyac started sending folks to look through missing people's homes, she says, to look through their personal belongings, to see if they had a passport, a birth certificate, if they sent money with names, on the order. And it was real difficult, because people weren't using their real identities. Sekou Siby understands the dilemma. He came to the United States in 1996, an undocumented immigrant fleeing political unrest in Cote D'Ivoire. He worked as a deliveryman in the Bronx, subsisting solely on tips. A few years later, he had secured a work permit as he sought asylum status. He says when his roommate got him a job as a prep cook at World Trade Center, it felt like a big break. The WTC was the hub of global finance, a symbol of money and power. For hundreds of immigrants, it also was a place of stable, but low-wage employment.